Well, good morning, everybody. I am Trish Shaw. I'm the CEO and founder of Beyond Reach Consulting, an AI ethics and AI governance consulting business. I am also part of Women Leading in AI, and I'm on the IEEE Algorithmic Bias Project P7003. So I'm here in lieu of Alison Gardner, just in case you're expecting Alison Gardner. She sends her a sincere apology. She's fallen ill en route, so please do accept her apologies for that. So it is today with my privilege that I get to introduce everyone here on the panel and be the compere for this morning. So I shall firstly introduce you to Mike Clancy, who's General Secretary and Chief Executive of Prospect Union. If you'd like to give a word of yourself.
Thanks very much. Good morning, everybody. So Prospect's union of 145,000 members. We represent technologists, specialists across the public and private sector. Most of our members are in the private sector. I'll say a little bit more of it when I talk to you, but we've just restyled ourselves as the Union for Ambition. We are not politically affiliated, which I have to say I think is a really good thing these days. The Union for Ambition is about reaching out to a whole range of different workers in a different way. I'll say more about that.
Fantastic. And now over to you, Chrissy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chrissy. I'm Head of Digital Influencing at Scope. That is the UK's leading disability equality charity. I am running a programme called The Big Hack, and it's looking at how the tech world is generally very non-inclusive of disabled people and how we can try and work and campaign and work with government to fix that.
Hi there. My name's Jessie Leonard. I'm the Director of External Affairs for Visa's Data Science Lab, which is based one in Singapore, one right here in London, and then we also have, through the global organisation, a large number of data scientists and engineers all working in this area, massively scaling up at the moment, as you would expect.
And over to Katie.
Hello, I'm Katie Alpin. I'm Head of Research and Policy at the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute. We're a small charity focused on research and policy, trying to break the links between money and mental health problems. Because today in the UK, if you have a mental health problem, as 1 in 4 of us does, you're 3.5 times as likely to be in problem debt, and half of people in problem debt also have a mental health problem. We're here to fix that.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, everybody. I'd like to firstly hand over to Jessica to give us a bit of a provocation and some thought leadership here for this panel.
Anyone who knows me would never describe me as provocative. No, I mean, we're hugely proud as Visa to be sponsoring this panel today, and just want to say a huge thank you to techUK, who put together these fantastic events and get the right people in the room. We're actually members of techUK's Skills and Diversity Council, which does incredible work in this area. So, provocation. One of my favourite quotes when I think about diversity and inclusion in tech is William Gibson, who is a brilliant, brilliant writer, and he said in 1999, the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And if that was true in 1999, I think a lot of us feel that it's equally true, if not more so, today. Half the world is still not digitally connected. Billions and billions of people. When we look at digital connection and the links between that and other types of exclusion. When you come to financial exclusion, and we look at this all the time in payments, we've seen around the world the potential of digital payments to be a springboard for economic participation. And yet there are still billions of people who don't have bank accounts around the world. 1.5 million people in the UK do not have a bank account. And because digital is the gateway to participation of so many areas now, that's what links all these things. So we're seeing these really worrying links emerging between issues like mental health and disability and financial exclusion and economic participation. It is the gateway. We also have, in the tech sector, a diversity and inclusion situation. As everybody is probably aware, some fantastic new research came out from PwC about this yesterday. Nesta's done some brilliant research on it too, the NYU. I mean, you can find the same sort of picture emerging pretty much everywhere, which is whatever criteria you use, whether it's who's studying STEM subjects, whether it's who the researchers are, whether it's who the people are teaching these things, who's in the leadership positions. Even in the PwC research, there was a question to kids, what do you see yourself doing in the future? And only a tiny proportion of the kids that they asked who were from minority groups said, I want to work in the tech sector. They don't see that future for themselves. So that's a worry. Having depressed everybody a little bit, I want to talk a bit about what should be an obvious question, but I think the moment that we start to treat it as obvious, we start to create an echo chamber and we stop being impactful. And the question is, why is diversity and inclusion in the digital world important? Why is it important in the context of digital ethics? And I think it's really fundamental. I think it actually cuts to what kind of digital world do we want to build. And when I say what kind of digital world, you might as well for that read today, what kind of world do we want to build? So when we talk about ethics, digital ethics, we're talking about technology being completely value neutral. It's amoral, right? Unless we program it in, unless we carefully program in ethical codes and values, it will continue to be amoral. So we have to think very, very carefully about who's doing that programming and what their value system is. So if we're talking about value systems, millennia-old philosophies in some cases, which were, across the course of history, as I've learned from my wonderful friends at Women Leading in AI, largely influenced by white, Western, male philosophy. And that is being programmed in a very, very real way into the way that we do AI and data science today. We see the real impact of that in this vicious cycle of junk in, junk out, the wrong data sets being used, models being programmed without the diverse range of perspectives that we need, and that further embeds bias, further embeds exclusion. It really is a vicious cycle, and it's happening in very real terms. This is not about CSR, it's not about good corporate citizenship. Well, it is, but it's not just about that. This has a very, very real world impact. So on the panel, I'm delighted to say there are people here with far deeper expertise than me in all of these areas, in representing the views of workers, people with disabilities, people with mental health problems, but I suspect that we strongly share the same perspective when it comes to the sort of digital world that we want to see. And a fear that if we don't have diverse perspectives, we are going to be building in injustice. There's going to be less innovation, less creativity. We're simply going to be underserving ourselves as a society. I want to touch a little bit on the good, the bad, and the ugly of what we're seeing emerging in the digital world. Particularly, I want to talk about data science and AI, which is something that we're focusing on a huge amount at Visa. So, in the bad camp to start off with, and I'm not going to name names, but everyone will know various examples in the last year alone of all these areas. So we are seeing racial bias in facial recognition. We are seeing gender bias emerging quite strongly in recruitment. I mean, my female CEO and me maybe wouldn't have jobs if we were using some of the current AI-powered recruitment tools out there today. We're seeing it in reoffending. The tools that people are using, the data-driven tools that people are using to predict reoffending rates, which have been shown to be hugely biased against different ethnic minorities. And we're seeing it in, that doesn't happen to me often on a panel. Okay, don't worry. Oh, there you go. Biased credit. Now, this is one I really shouldn't have forgotten because this is something we're working on ourselves. So the idea of using AI and data to expand access to credit is a brilliant idea. It's terrible if what ends up happening is that you choose the wrong data and you build your model wrong. And what happens is actually when you're trying to expand financial inclusion, you end up with somebody being given a higher credit, being given a lower credit rating, when actually that's genuinely a biased discriminatory decision. So moving on to the good stuff. Just so that we can all have a moment to smile. So as I said, there are credit products out there which have been deliberately designed in order to expand access to credit for millennials, for people with thin file, immigrants who are not able yet to establish a credit rating for themselves, more granular, better analysis which can help to correct perhaps some of the misjustices of the past which stay on someone's credit rating for ages if you use these very blunt tools. So that's fantastic. There's a lot of really good work going on in data science and AI around how you can tackle exclusion in terms of mental health. We talked about this on a panel by the brilliant Dr. Becky Inkster, who's here today from the Turing Institute, who's working on Fin Health Tech. Anyone who's not aware of her project, go and look it up. It's amazing. Very much focused on health in general, but mental health particularly. We see it in the types of solutions that are emerging to empower customers who feel very vulnerable for certain reasons. It might be because they have a gambling problem, it might be a mental health problem, it might be a life resilience issue. So the tech is really genuinely helping there. Microsoft, one of the big names of today's conference, we wouldn't be here without them. They've been doing an extraordinary program around tech, digital accessibility, which is something really, really worth going and looking up, particularly for anyone here who's working in a company and isn't using these products yet. And one other thing which I think it's controversial but potentially very exciting, which is the use of AI itself to identify and correct bias. This is something we obviously want to be very careful with, but I suspect that in the future it's going to emerge. And the simple fact that we now have the word fairness in pretty much every digital ethics and AI ethics and data ethics framework around the world, I think is testament to how much people are really thinking about this. Obviously, none of this would be happening without the campaigning groups and the companies and the individuals and experts who are supporting all this. Diversity.ai is brilliant. Women Leading in AI, .everyone. There are so many of these now, and it's fantastic. I do think companies have this really squarely in their sights now. There are new targets specifically emerging for the tech part of businesses and for the tech sector, which I do think is important. Visa, and I'm not saying this just to big ourselves up, although we are proud of it. In Forbes' list this year, we were number 10 in most diverse companies, but that's not really the important part because we're not going to be happy till we're number 1. The important part is we were number 41 last year. So we are taking this really, really seriously. I think employee activism, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this later, but employee activism can be hugely important here. There was a brilliant .everyone report about the extraordinary number of employees in AI who would actually leave and have left their jobs because they felt morally uncomfortable about something. So within Visa, we have Visa Women in Tech Network. We have the Visa Pride Network, the Visa Black Employees Network, the Visa Employees Network for people with disabilities. And these are not just names on a mailing list. These are people who actively stand up and demand to make their views heard. And that's incredibly important, and we do everything we can to encourage that. Finally, I just want to zoom out a little bit and talk about something we always talk about at these events, and we need to keep talking about, which is trust. I think there has been quite an extraordinary evolution, tech-powered, of the civil liberties, civil rights movement around the world. Black Lives Matter, Me Too movement, just to name a couple, were very much spread and powered by technology. And these are the voices of people in society who have felt that they as individuals and groups have been discriminated against by the people in power. And I think this is very much something that the tech industry wants to listen to. Because shareholder activism is on the rise. Employee activism and walkouts are on the rise. I think that people from these minority groups are going to make their voices heard. And I want to include the public in that too, because there is the issue of self-exclusion, refusal to participate. And so the Edelman Trust Barometer this year said that over 2/3 of people do not trust companies to be making the right long-term decisions when it comes to AI. That's really, really worrying when you think about diversity and inclusion, who's going to go work in those industries, how people feel affected by those industries. And we saw just one really, poignant example of that in our own sector. So in Hong Kong during the riots, there was a picture of a queue of hundreds of people queuing outside one of the metro stations following one of the protests. And we couldn't work out why they were queuing, and we realized that it was a queue for the one cash teller in that metro station, because those people did not want to use digital payments on that day. They did not want to participate in the digital economy on that day because they felt unsafe doing it. So I will finish there. I hope that was provocative enough.
Well, thank you very much, Jessica. I think it definitely was. Inclusivity and diversity is something very close to my heart, and I think we run the risk, if we don't identify this soon enough, to have an underclass of digitally excluded and financially excluded people. And on that note, I think it's really interesting about the self-registration piece as well, and actually, are people making unwise choices in there, not engaging, or are they actually making wise choices and not engaging? I think it depends on what group, what societal group they form into, and whether or not they're getting sufficient representation on that. But just on that note then, I believe that societal engagement and greater social dialogue on these matters are important to help identify the two kinds of stakeholder groups that are largely at risk here. One is those who are impacted directly by the technologies that are coming out, and the other is those who are influencing the technologies that are coming out. So we've got two kinds of groups that need really clear guidance on the diversity and inclusivity in them. So yeah, just on that note, sort of with those groups in mind, and those specifically, we've got quite a number of excluded groups that we can think about today, actually. How are excluded groups currently being engaged when organisations build or deploy, or as we heard this morning, purchase in advanced digital technologies, particularly data-driven technologies? Who would be liking to answer that question? Thanks, Katie.
Not enough, I think, is what we'd see at Money and Mental Health. I don't think anyone's necessarily going to disagree with that one. So at Money and Mental Health, we run a research community, a group of 5,000 people with experience of mental health problems who we talk to every single week. When I tell that to particularly financial services and other essential services firms, they tend to look really shocked. We're a charity of 8 people, how do you do that? Well, it's hard work, but it's doable. And we did a tech sprint with the Financial Conduct Authority several years ago. And as part of that, because lived experience is at the heart of everything we do, we brought some people with lived experience into the room with those people building new products. And one, the developers said what a positive experience that was, but also it was something that was quite nerve-wracking. It wasn't a thing that they'd done before, actually having in the same room as a hackathon people with lived experience. And that shock for me, that this was such a novel thing to be doing, really brought home that we're not doing enough of this. And I think sometimes we're scared to talk to people because it means asking honest questions and really listening about where we're currently going wrong and admitting that we've made mistakes. And so I think it does take great courage, but when we can do it, gosh, it really works. And what came out of that tech sprint was some brilliant products, some of which have finally got into the hands of consumers and are making a difference to people's lives, which is what it's all about, isn't it?
Absolutely. So in terms of that hackathon, you saw some new technologies coming out. So what do the group feel that needs to be done to ensure that the technology is accessible, especially to people with disabilities? I certainly, for one, had the privilege of running a session with the Society of Computer Law on inclusive design just a few weeks ago, where we had the great Harben Girma come over from the US. She's the first deaf-blind Eritrean disability rights advocate. She's a lawyer by training. She survived Harvard Law School. And we had to run and challenged ourselves as lawyers to run a very inclusive event. And she's had to create her own technology to be able to interface with people. And that's the strength of passion and determination she has. But there are many people with disabilities that don't have that, either that sway, influence, or determination. They might have the determination, but are finding themselves not heard. I suppose I turn this question to yourself from at Scope. So,
yeah, so
Chrissy, sorry.
There's certainly a lengthy answer to this. But I guess if I'm sticking with the digital sphere, there is a real issue in lack of accessibility of online products and services. So there's 14 million disabled people in the UK. That's about 1 billion people globally. And we know that about 98% of the kind of main websites on the internet are not accessible to the global minimum standard. There are regulations out there. There's quite clear guidance on how to make a website accessible. However, a lot of businesses are not using those. There's many reasons for that. I think fundamentally the government isn't doing anything to actually uphold those standards. So businesses are able to kind of not be held to account on that. But also I think the real issue is, and it kind of flows from wider society and the built environment as well, and that's that businesses just do not recognise disabled customers as valid consumers. And it's a real issue that goes from kind of offline shopping and all those interactions and education back into the digital space. Essentially, the digital world is only taking on the bias that we all have in the real world. It's just another world, essentially, that's taking on our same opinions. Scope have recently done a piece of research. We are building the business case for inclusive design because we can demonstrate that actually building an inclusive, accessible product online and offline will make you more valuable as a business. You'll make more money. There's a report by Accenture which demonstrates this, and you actually see double the net profit on your business compared to other businesses when you make an inclusive customer offer. Accessible design is really good design. It improves your SEO and all kinds of other things. So really what we're doing in the Big Hack is we're just trying to wake businesses up to this. It's kind of like shaking them and say, hi, guys, come on, like implement this. You'll see much better profit margins. You'll see much more loyal customers. So hopefully we can get that 98% down and have an impact in the real world as well.
That's really interesting because it is an untapped market, actually, and that was something Harb and Germer brought out, and actually those technological changes that are made, they benefit all. We think, we don't even think about actually anymore, curb cuts. So these are the cuts in the curb as you walk across a road. They were originally designed for people with wheelchairs, but they benefit people with buggies, and they benefit people who are blind because they've got the bumps at the head of it as well. But they benefit us all, people who skateboard, people who scoot, And if we're kind of seeing that as a benefit, that's in the real world, kind of in the digital world, what kind of other benefits are there? So we think about one of the other examples Harben actually gave, and I was ever impressed with her, was the fact that, if you've got the tags at the bottom of the screen with the text, that's really helpful for someone who's watching something that has to be in a quiet environment. It benefits us all. It's not just for people who are disabled. So we should stop thinking about people being excluded and isolated in that way and thinking about this is just another consumer market that benefits everybody. So just on that note, how is improving inclusivity and diversity currently driving better outcomes for excluded groups? And I just wonder if, Mike, you had any thoughts on that?
Sure. Excuse me. Well, maybe an opportunity just to talk about a couple of things that have already been said in answering the last question you posed. As Jessica said about, if you talk about technology, you're really talking about what type of world. Well, I think we see technology as also influencing what type of workspace. And I deliberately choose the word workspace over workplace because we have a much more diffuse set of working stances, and people will cycle through different forms of work at different times in their careers and their work spans, all of which are rising, as we know, as people are working longer. Sometimes people happily working longer, and sometimes people working longer because they have to. The .everyone survey, which was mentioned, we picked up on that. About 28% of the people who responded to the survey who were technologists felt they'd actually been engaged in a decision which had a negative effect potentially on society, and around 20% of them were prepared to leave as a result of that. For us, again, the issue is making these things integral to corporate decision making. I mean, there's a massive debate currently underway, and depending on what happens Thursday and onwards, and in this country and more widely, there's a massive debate about what sort of capitalism we're going to have. I was at an event like this a week or so ago, where a leading CEO was talking about the purposeful business, and actually particularly talking about an important value in a new corporate world of empathy. Now, I couldn't help but say that where chief financial officers are in control, empathy may be in less supply. But that was cheap, and I decided I wouldn't repeat it, but I just have. But the point about this is that empathy, if that's an important new advanced dynamic, that's very crucial to the wraparound to technological development. And the contributions we've already heard here are about making these things the natural way we do things, rather than a prodded or prompted add-on, whether it be disability, whether it be inclusivity and diversity. I think our biggest concern is that we don't want to be, as a trade union of our type. I said to you in the introduction that we've recently rebranded ourselves as a union for ambition. Now, what does that mean? It can sound very pompous. Well, most of the people we represent are successful. They want to get on. They want the union to be a platform for them to get further on. They're fascinating people doing fascinating things, everything from the end credits in film and TV, through to infrastructure technologists, through to government scientists. And this morning I was with a group of archaeologists who were low paid and got many degrees. So there's a whole range of people in our union. But they're all people who care about the organisations that they work for, and they don't come to work to be disruptive. They come to work to make progress. That's why we talk about ambition, but we also say we want to help you to get on, but if you can't, we'll help you get even. The problem is if you're in the get even space, then you're in a space of negativity. And I think a number of people come to us when they've been adversely affected by change, and the whole technology debate has the possibility of simply magnifying existing inequalities, existing power imbalances in workspaces, and magnifying them with an intensity that none of us can yet fully predict. So I think the obligation on all of us is to take a serious look at how we democratically, regulatory, and control these potential outcomes. I was saying to Jessica before we started, if you look at parts of Europe, they're having conversations which are far more rich, both macro and micro, about these subjects. Probably because of our political fractures, we're not getting to that, which is, I think, deeply unfortunate. And therefore, not wanting to take a dystopian view, but we do see some harm and damage along the way unless we get these things right. Technology drives change. How well you handle change management, ensure inclusivity and diversity of thought goes into that, is an existing challenge. But as is how people's conduct, performance, is praised and managed and developed, and their own neural diversity is taken into account. A lot of the people we represent, we've done a lot of work on neural diversity of late, presented their employers in a way that their employers need. They are formalized thinkers, they are very logical, and they're structured, and they get things done. How well they handle the ambiguity of change is another matter. And in this space, there may be quite a lot of people with those sort of neural pathways. Understanding that diversity, that it brings you benefit, but means you also have to harness a different set of behaviors, is crucial at the micro level. And again, the technology, if we don't manage it well, has the opportunity to amplify a particular set of expectations, a particular set of corporate expectations, a particular set of messaging, which some people may have great difficulty adapting to. And therefore, you will not be getting the richness and diversity of the workforce. So I very much echo that these things need to be integral. They aren't prompted add-ons that we better do to look like better corporate citizens. They are what good companies do, and they are what democratic civic society expect and require for the next generation of technological development. Now, I'm happy to develop that more from our different interest areas. But I think we're very much at a watershed. It's really interesting. I'll just close at this stage and this point. You know, trade unions carry all sorts of baggage. You know, if you're getting on a train and you can't get on it, you're annoyed by the trade union. Let's be clear about that. If, however, that train journey is getting you to a workplace where you're being personally represented, you want the strongest union in the world at the end of the train journey. So there's lots of dislocations. But one of the key things I think about trade unions is we can be really good constructive friends. And I can pray no better organisation than AID than the FT this week, who said, if you want to know what your workforce are thinking, ask a trade union.
And thank you for that contribution. And I think it's very clear that, you know, if we're going to try and change this landscape of inclusivity and diversity, it's got to start from the inside out. And that by having that inclusivity and diversity internally, it will impact on the outcomes these companies, as we all are producing. Jessica?
I just want to come back on a really important point in there. So when you talked about financial controllers and how different bits of a business might view this, and I want to talk about it particularly in the context of automated decision-making and use of AI. So I talked to a brilliant finance guy the other day, and he was very, very excited about the prospect of AI in this credit decision-making concept. And he said, but this is great, we can become perfect. We can make the perfect decision about somebody's creditworthiness. This is incredible, you know, really true excitement there. And I said, yeah, but being technologically perfect could create a serious issue with humanity. And he said, but okay, humanity is the politician's job. We're not bad, you know, we're not bad guys at X company. You know, we're not going to make inhumane decisions. And I gave him this story, which I thought was very, very interesting, which I read in a brilliant book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, and that really is provocative. That really is provocative. But the story was about a repo guy in the States, a car repossession guy, and he gets sent by his company to go and repossess the car, and he arrives at this couple's house, and they're an elderly couple, and they've been very unwell, and they haven't been able to afford, this is in the States, they haven't been able to afford the payments for their car and the medication that they're both now taking. And the repo guy has a conversation with them, ends up coming in, having a cup of tea, and he ends up calling his agency, and he says, listen, I think we should be giving these guys some leeway here. There must be someone in the company they can talk to. They're clearly vulnerable. They're clearly excluded. And he gets no. And he refuses to leave their house for several hours until he reaches the right person in the company who says, well, actually, yes, we do have policies for these sorts of people, and, you know, and somebody should talk to them. And actually, the end of the story was that tech created, the story got picked up by a local paper, ended up going viral, and there was a fund created to buy these people a car. That's very nice, but that's not really my point. My point is that if we had an AI at work there, which actually just cut your car engine off, right, for your autonomous vehicle, and you got a message. The same voice that tells you how to make your pancakes, right, in the morning, or answers a song about that silly song lyric, is now the voice saying, your car has been repossessed, you have not kept up with your payments, please leave the vehicle, someone will be there to collect it shortly. That's a world in which the decision might have been technically perfect, but the humanity wasn't there. And I would argue that that's not just a moral concern, right? As you say, companies, yes, talk to us about the money as well, right? So in that situation, it would have been incredibly stupid for the company to destroy relationships with its customers, which large groups of its customers whose circumstances are shifting often, but who may still be loyal customers. Why remove the humanity from those relationships and create this barrier between companies and people? We all understand people's lives change, people's circumstances change. It's a very short-sighted thing to do, to go for technologically perfect over and above humanity.
And that's the challenge, isn't it? That when we create AI, when we use the algorithms, we need certainty. And consumers need certainty of result. But actually, we live in an uncertain world where there's so many variables. And to play, I don't know if Ruben's in the room actually, but I know Ruben somewhere around in this conference, Ruben Binns from the ICO, to play to something that he's certainly written and spoken about before, and on behalf of the ICO, is about justice in the individual case. And that's a classic example, the Zuboff example of justice in the individual case. And it doesn't take much. You know Visa yourself. It doesn't take much to give people a payment break and a payment holiday. And that's a small solution. But how can we embed that in digital ethics? Thanks.
It's also
Katie.
really important to know that we're not always going to be able to spot these people. So not every disability is visible. If a quarter of us are experiencing mental health problems at any time, well, actually, 36% of people experiencing a common mental disorder like depression or anxiety in England right now have never received a diagnosis and are not seeking any medical treatment. So they couldn't tell you that they're unwell if they wanted to. Now, that really means that actually this isn't just about finding people and offering something different. It has to be at the heart of every design decision that we make. And actually, a quick example that both Mike and Jesse's contributions made me think of is offering credit to people and kind of what our motivations are when we're building some of these systems. So banks have been competing for how quickly they can offer people credit, right? Because the longer your journey takes, the less likely someone's going to get all the way through and you'll be able to lend them money. So you can now get a loan in some bank apps in 3 taps. That's all it takes. And for some of us, some of the time, that's brilliant. It means I don't have to spend ages doing paperwork. It's all sorted, fantastic. For a person potentially with something like bipolar disorder, where increased impulsivity is a clinical symptom, we have heard of people being able to take out tens of thousands of pounds of credit using these very fast processes and ending up in enormous trouble. That causes them problems for decades afterwards as they try to mop up the mess they made when they were unwell. Now, actually, there are some decisions to be made about what do we want to prioritise here. Is it important that things are very fast and very profitable? Or actually, is a little bit of marginal inconvenience to me when I'm well a price worth paying for something that's more accessible and doesn't cause the harm? But we're going to have to get into some quite fundamental questions there about what we're prioritising if we're going to make the right decisions about these things.
I think there's some really good initiatives, I think, with the vulnerability registration service where people are self-aware enough to be able to register. And there's some initiatives with regard to vampire shopping or indeed vampire loan taking on. It's classic that when people are having bipolar episodes, it tends to be in the middle of the night, or they go out shopping or go out taking loans in the middle of the night when vampires exist. But there's some initiatives to actually defer the decisions being made till the early hours or later hours of the morning, where that can have another separate triage process. So there's some initiatives, but is it enough really? So I think Mike wanted to say a word, if that's okay, Jessica.
Yeah, I mean, Jessica's example is really powerful. I think there's several things you can take out of it. What I take out of that is something that we see quite a lot of, is that you shouldn't have to rely upon bravery. I'd be really interested in the repo man's subsequent performance review at his level in the business unit of having detained the organisation on this moment of empathy, which is actually more important to the organisation than they can probably ever calculate, because the reputational damage arising out of that behaviour, both locally, regionally, or whatever it may be, is just absolutely huge. I mean, my short point is this, that I can fill this room with any number of corporate policies, well written, on a whole range of subjects, and probably several directly in this area. But it doesn't matter if the organisational culture in no way reflects the written word in the policy. And we're really talking about cultural stuff here. I know in my own organisation, I employ people, and I occasionally think it would be better to just have the whole place automated just with me, and then my opinion will go through the whole place. You know, so we all have those moments. But actually, the richness of organisations come out of their people, but it's critically, what does your culture look like? What does your culture say to you? And, you know, audiences I've recently been with, you know, I've posed the question, and I think it's absolutely right to this. In the next 5 years in this country, do you think equality is going to narrow or increase? Depending on how you feel about that, think about the technology's contribution to those dynamics. Because I think that's a significant issue for any society, and that comes down to our culture, our cultural choices, our political choices, and those play into the workspace. And I just hope that we are in a new age of empathy, because if you have an age of empathy, you won't have the corporate culture where that person has to force themselves bravely up the line to get an answer, knowing they're about to do damage to individuals, but probably also knows they're about to do damage to the company as well.
So we need a cultural shift, not only internally in organisations from going from inside out, but also from the outside. We need a societal cultural shift to help people understand more empathetically the harms and the issues at play here with a number of different people groups. And I think people are quite agnostic to technology and will only really care when it physically harms them. And I think when someone's excluded from finance, or when someone becomes over-indebted, and they either lose their job or they have a mental health episode in the midst of all that, or indeed that they get a terminal illness, that's when people will start to feel the pain. Why should we wait till then for people to really find out the home truths? So I think, Jessica, you want to say something next? Oh, so Chrissy.
So, I mean, just on that, I was going to say that I think often we take action when it's too late. And I mean, an example of the self-driving car running over a woman with a bicycle, because it didn't recognise that as a human being, because it had only been taught models by which there was kind of a human that was the norm. So it was someone standing without a bicycle. And we do think kind of how many people are in wheelchairs, because it wouldn't have known that was the norm either, a person with wheels. And there have been plenty of examples of where AI just has not been taught to look for things that are outside of the norm. And again, with self-driving car models, I don't know if anyone's read the NYU report on AI and bias. It's absolutely fantastic. Yeah. And it does have an example of a scholar whose friend worked in a self-driving car kind of lab, and they were teaching machine learning models, and they showed the machine essentially data on someone who was in a wheelchair, and the way that person used the wheelchair was to propel themselves backwards. Well, even though it had been taught about wheelchairs, it hadn't been taught about the different way that people use their wheelchairs. So it didn't recognise that someone pushing themselves backwards was, again, a human, and decided to run her over. So, you know, we're seeing this stuff quite under the scene, under the radar. You know, it's good that it was flagged up in this report, but when things actually get pushed out there, and it was sort of Mark Zuckerberg's famous phrase, move fast, break things, when things are actually happening that way and businesses aren't held to account, then they're breaking people's lives, they're breaking society, and it really has a huge implication. And what you say about the next 5 years, you know, I love digital, and I started working in digital with, you know, huge amounts of passion, still very passionate about the wonderful things it can do. It can be a real equaliser, and it has been seen to be amongst the disabled population. But also, the more and more I get engrossed in this, the more concerned I am for the next 5 years, because government just aren't doing anything. They're not watching this, and people who are leading businesses don't seem to be kind of taking accountability on as part of what they do, or actually changing their culture. So I am concerned. I'm glad we're here today to discuss this. I really am. I think it would be nice to see it discussed outside of these rooms and these events as well, more often.
Jessica, you want to say something?
I hope, without sounding too cynical and self-serving, I can reassure you some businesses are taking it very seriously. But listen, I agree with you. I do agree with you. And actually, there's a couple of examples that I wanted to touch on in terms of regulation where potentially there's a lack of clarity here as well. So a lot of the points you raise around getting the right algorithm come from are you using the right input data? And there is a lack of clarity here, I think, not just in the UK, but more generally about do you include as much data as you possibly can from minority groups, which is often very sensitive personal data, around which there is huge trepidation and not a massive amount of regulatory clarity. Do you include it in your models? Because on that basis, you are hopefully going to be mitigating bias. Or are you actually concerned about the privacy implications, concerned about the sensitivity, concerned about the reputational consequences, and you don't include it? And there's actually a bit of a moral dilemma there. I think it's really interesting. I mean, we see it in finance. So I had one of our banking clients the other day say to us, listen, we're honestly not sure between the FCA telling us to use data to help vulnerable customers and the ICO, genuinely putting what is probably an appropriate level of concern on us about using personal sensitive information. We're just kind of stuck, and actually we don't even want to look under the hood about what we've got right now in case we're suddenly under an obligation to use it, which gets us into trouble. So that's a deeply unhelpful type of paralysis. I just want to touch on one other thing, which is that I think there's a danger on the horizon here in terms of whether or not our current categories of protected groups are going to be adequate as this technology advances. So we're seeing new forms of discrimination emerge through inferences, which are built on data sets and algorithms, and they will draw an inference, and there could be a type of discrimination in there which is much harder to see and was almost certainly unintentional, I would hope, with good actors. But this is an issue. It is happening. So whether or not that means a rethink about human rights, and I know that there's a joint committee in Parliament doing that right now. The World Economic Forum are doing it. A lot of people are doing it. Whether it's that we need to recognise a right of reasonable inferences, which is something that's been talked about by some brilliant academics from the Turing in Oxford in this country. Whether we just need to get better at learning what data to include or exclude, so that we make sure that we're doing justice to potentially vulnerable groups.
No, I would agree wholeheartedly with that. And there is a school of thought about, I think it's anti-discriminatory privacy. And that's whereby people are pooling into their data representative pool the characteristics that are protected in order to ensure that they've got a representative pool of data assets that plug into the AI behind the scenes, so as to ensure that there's positivity in the discrimination, we're not ending up with unlawful discrimination in the outcomes, and also to identify where the AI, the neural nets, whichever algorithm system is being used, is actually making the correct outputs when they're validating it and using it in an operationalised environment. But there's also the question of whether that's the data pool that's used in an operational fashion, or whether that's just the data pool that's used when you test it and then obviously validate it. So there's does that then need to follow through? So there's a school of thought, do we need to use protected characteristics in all the data sets, or is it just in that testing and validation pool to ensure it? I'm kind of conscious, obviously, Katie, you wanted to talk there as well, but I'm conscious we want to get some questions from the audience. But also, I don't want any of us leaving this room without a clear kind of focus on how we can add to this debate, how we can make change happen. We've talked about, the need for changing our culture internally, inside our organisations where we currently exist and subsist, but also how we can go about raising this issue, making the awareness known in wider society, and whether that's empathy or whether that's identifying harm or the potential for harm, because people will only care once it really impacts them. And we've already seen with the Cambridge Analytica scandal that harm was so intangible it didn't really make the impact it needed to.
Can I disagree there, Trish?
Okay,
because I think people do care even when they're not seeing impacts. So we've recently completed a piece of research, partly in partnership with the FCA, which was looking at the potential to use financial transactions data to identify people in potentially vulnerable situations and offer proactive support, on the basis that lots of people, particularly when they're unwell, find it really hard to ask for help, particularly when it's about financial things. And this isn't something that any bank in the UK is doing on a big scale now. There are little bits of testing going on, but nothing big. So it's not something that people are currently experiencing. But actually, when we go out and we went out and talked to people with mental health problems, what do you think about this? What would concern you? Actually, the quality of those conversations was really high. And I think too often we are frankly patronising. and we say this is, oh, it's AI, it's machine learning, it's very complicated, we can barely differentiate these terms, we can't ask the public what they think. You can. You can. And it's our job to facilitate that conversation and break the questions down so people can have a say on these things. But we're governing people's lives here. We have to listen to what people want and make it so that they can be part of that conversation, because people do care when you give them a chance to have a say.
I think they probably do care. It's just the challenge of they don't have a reasonable, viable platform through which to an alternative to the platforms that are available to them. So it's about how do we as businesses not only become more inclusive and diverse internally, but how can we offer alternative platforms that are viable for people. So I haven't unfortunately got the Slido pad.
We might just ask.
Fabulous. Yeah. Right. Is anyone any questions? So the gentleman, three-quarters in, that's yourself, yeah, sorry. Is there a roaming mic? Can you introduce yourself first?
Sorry, I should do that. Michael Hobbs from reputable.ai. It's hard to say. I was slightly surprised by the starting speech of this conference from Elizabeth Denham, who referred to, and her words were, whether a digital underclass is forming. Whether a digital underclass is forming. I think it's entirely apparent that we have several digital underclasses, perhaps the biggest of which is the millions of workers in this country and all over the world who work entirely to algorithms. And we, I think, are also complicit in this by not thinking about what is a reasonable price to pay for the goods and services that we purchase. And it applies to the Uber ride we take, or the Bolt ride we take, or the things that we purchase from Just Eat, everything in this digital meets physical world. And I wonder if you've got any comments on both those topics, both the complicity and the fact that those underclasses are already very much here.
Can I just quickly, and then you, but I would say, as I said before, it's the same in the real world. And if we look at kind of a consumerist society, fast fashion is a huge, huge issue in this day and age. It's got massive implications for the environment. So it's not just a digital discussion. I think it's a discussion around consumerism in general and what people maybe not having the knowledge of, what the cheap thing is coming from and the implications of that. And actually there just needs to be more transparency.
I completely agree, but it's accelerated, it's magnified by the digital interaction.
Well, that's exactly what I said a few moments ago. There are existing imbalances in power in our society. There are existing inequalities, and this whole technological change process will simply exacerbate it. The question is whether we care enough to do anything about it on a micro and a macro basis. And I suppose, having the privilege of being a trade union general secretary and seeing all sorts of different spaces, I really question whether we do. People in this room probably do, because you're here, you're listening, you're engaged, and you care about it, and people on this panel clearly do. But we've allowed an underclass to develop in this country anyway. Technology is just going to exacerbate their dislocation. And a whole range of groups that you talk about there relate back to their economic circumstance. Wage rates, pace of change, voice in change, rollback of trade unions, rollback of civic voice, fake news. I mean, there are a whole range of dystopian drivers here. If we really want to walk out of here very negative, the challenge for us is to harness a progressive view of society and change our cultures, change our behaviors, change our corporations, democratize them, allow them to still make money, crucially. This is not an argument about fundamentally saying capitalism's wrong, but capitalism needs to be able to share, it needs to be able to play its role properly in society, it needs to be properly regulated, and there is a wide debate about that. We had a conversation just recently, just inside listening our organisation this morning, where we're talking about our vision and we're talking about our new technology choices. Critical thing to get right, first of all, is our vision, and then the technology will enable it. So what's our vision as a society? What's our vision for corporations? What's our vision for our public services? And then you make the technology work for you.
And I think the approach has been it's this distinction between individuals and serving the individual versus serving the society and understanding that societal impact as well. I think we're starting to wake up a little bit more about what this societal impact is So just before, does anyone else want to, Jessica or Katie?
We'll take a
And
couple
then
of
there's another
questions.
question, yeah. Lady.
Hi there. My name is Antoinette. I'm with Sovereign Strategy. Can you hear me? It doesn't sound like... Ah, cool.
Yeah, okay, you're on there.
So, yeah, hi. My name is Antoinette. I'm with Sovereign Strategy. We are advisors to tech and fintech firms. Before I started my job, someone said to me, in tech firms, or maybe in other firms generally, workers, employees say to themselves, if we're good people, how can we do bad things? And apparently that gets them quite far in the work that they do. But on the other side of that, in the recent years, like you said, Cambridge Analytica and lots of other problems that have surfaced, the .everyone report on tech employees' attitudes have changed rapidly. I wanted to get your take on the pace of the change and how you folks have differentiated between, let's say, the younger staff in tech firms and their attitudes to change versus those folks at the top who have got senior management experience and who've got the age to show that, and what their position is on change and their feeling around responsibility and corporate social responsibility. Thank you.
I'd love to take that. I think that's a fascinating question. So there's two things I would say. First of all, yes, age seems to be a factor. In the millennial and Gen Z generations, you certainly do see more of a bent towards activism, which is brilliant. 'Twas ever thus, but I think tech enables it and magnifies those voices and enables groups to form which have important things to say and do. So I do think that that's very important. But I don't think age is the only factor. I think that when I look culturally at an organization, which is a tech organization, you see that there are different viewpoints from different teams. It's not just about actually the diverse range of perspectives in terms of what group, how you might be defined as a group, as a person. Actually, when I talk to my data scientists, their mindset is what can be achieved. What is possible. They're scientists, they're explorers, right? They're innovators. They want to know what could be done. And that's quite right. That's why we need them. But do you have your governance right, that is tempered with and mixed with the right combination of people who are there to look at the ethics, to look at the governance? And I don't mean compliance, I do mean the ethics. Does the governance structure lend itself to that? Do you have people who are there representing the different types of consumers that are going to be impacted by this stuff? So I think employee activism is very important. I mentioned a few of the groups that we have within Visa, and they are noisy, and they should be noisy. And we do listen to them. We can definitely do more. And again, it sounds trite, but leadership is everything. We make sure that all of those groups I've mentioned have senior exec sponsorship. Otherwise, we're not doing enough to make sure they're taken seriously. But I think culture is really important. There are going to be different people pulling in different directions, and you have to, through your governance process, and I mean that in quite a practical way, as in, what is your AI development pipeline? What does it look like? And where are the junctures within that where you're getting the right mix between what could we do and what should we do? And what shouldn't we do?
I think we've got time for one more question.
Hi, is that on? Yeah. Imogen Parker from the Ada Lovelace Institute. I just wanted to know a bit of a wrap-up question around, do the panel feel we know what it is we need to do to get this right? And are we on that trajectory? Are we moving towards a better society, or are we moving away from it? Thanks.
Chrissy?
I don't think anyone has the answer, to be honest, at this point. But, what Scope certainly say around inclusion of disabled people is hire more disabled people, is kind of the creme de la creme of how you can build inclusive tech. But if that's not something that's happening, then make sure that you consult and co-create with disabled people. Make sure that they're involved at every process of your product life cycle as you go. It's quite challenging with AI because obviously it looks at data, and when people do things differently, it treats that data as an anomaly. And also someone in a wheelchair might do things differently to another person in a wheelchair. We don't all just live our lives the same. So that is a conundrum. Hiring more people with disabilities is, a fantastic thing to do because you get people contributing from the beginning, and also often disabled community are quite well networked amongst themselves. So we'll involve other voices and highlight where people are being excluded.
I would certainly say collaboration is absolutely key. This co-creation model, certainly at design, development and deployment and beyond, just keeping it in check all times. Katie?
I would agree with everything that Chrissy has said. Of course I would. But I think there's actually something about keeping the big picture in mind as well. So I'm really aware that it's very easy to focus on bad news. We very rarely get newspaper stories about fantastic, exciting uses of AI and what good they're doing. And they are out there, but it tends not to capture our attention. So I think it's really important we have these conversations, but let's keep tempering the risks and how we manage those with the risks of not doing this. So the risks of missing out on the opportunities to get people the help that they need if we aren't brave enough to look some of these big questions in the face and work through them.
I think diversity in the workplace, yes. To me, it's absolutely the critical piece because, as you say, otherwise we are simply reflecting and embedding the biases that already exist today, and we're just putting through the lens of digital, and they're going to get worse. The other thing that I would say is, for any company like us who's developing these products, you have to keep the human being who's going to be impacted in mind as you're developing them. If you do that in every use case, one of our core ethics values is the word value. We have to be able to show in every use case that we do of data that there is a value there to the consumer, to the people whose lives are being impacted by the decision that we make. And I think if you keep that front of mind, you keep that humanity that I was talking about earlier. I mean, to Mike's kind of, dystopian vision, it's a risk. I think we're all very aware that it's a risk. But I also think that this sort of community gives me a lot of hope that we don't need to go that way.
Yeah, I'd echo that. If we can harness positivity, I stress we as a union are positive about change, provided that the people we have the privilege to represent and our voice is heard in the change. So that's a baseline. But in answering your question, I sort of start from a few points of where we are, which are going to be a little bit of a negative list for a minute. Bear with me. We have a gender pay gap. We have a gender pensions gap. We are low on the participation index in this country when it comes to collective voice in change. And we can quote evidence of if you are higher on the participation index, you adopt technology faster and you adopt technology better, both at a macro societal level and at an enterprise level, and then from there. So to some extent, we've got such a low base, we should be able to improve, if I'm honest. But I think actually people don't realise. We were having a conversation just recently internally about if we had £1 for every time somebody expresses an employment right to us that they don't have. They don't even know what's in their employment contracts. Probably keeps us in work, actually, which is quite good in that respect. However, the level of people's attention to these things is episodic. It's based upon sometimes an emotional stimulus, and it is rarely seen in the aggregate. And what is important about spaces like this is that we've convened and we've talked about the aggregate position. We've talked about it and stood back from it, and we are trying to think about doing something about it. So probably as ever with these things is, what do we do when we walk out this room? What one thing do we do differently, or one thing do we bring back into our organisation to think about differently? That's the key thing. And as civic society members, we've all got a responsibility here.
Right, can we give a round of applause to all of our panel members today? Please go out of this room and do differently in your environment. That's where we've got to start. Thank you.